My name is Sarah. I'm 31 years old, and for years my brother treated me like the family's invisible safety net while he played the untouchable golden boy. I kept telling myself he just didn't know how to handle real responsibility. But the moment that finally made the truth impossible to ignore came in a freezing hospital hallway. My brother refused to help pay for our father's heart surgery. He looked right at the three attending doctors and said, "He is a lost cause. Let him go." He claimed he had absolutely no money. Meanwhile, the leather key fob to the brand new car he had bought just 14 days ago was visibly dangling from his fingers. I paid the bills. He took the credit. I slept in waiting room chairs. He performed grief for the relatives. I thought my father would never see who his favorite child really was. I was wrong. I quietly paid the $78,400 medical bill myself. And when Dad finally woke up, I didn't scream or argue in front of everyone. I just handed my father a printed bank statement. My brother's face instantly turned a sickly, panicked green. What happened next didn't just shatter his perfect image, it tore open years of lies and completely dismantled the inheritance he thought he already controlled. Before I go on, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story speaks to you. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now let me take you back to understand how my brother Julian could stand in a hospital hallway and essentially sign our father's death warrant while holding the keys to a brand new Mercedes. You have to understand the economy of our family. In the Reynolds household, there was a very specific exchange rate for love. Julian traded in charm, potential, and someday. I traded in spreadsheets, overtime shifts, and the quiet labor of being the one who actually showed up. My father, Arthur, spent 40 years building a mid-sized logistics company from a single rented truck. He was a man of cold facts and hard edges, but he had a blind spot the size of a continent when it came to his only son. Julian was the visionary. Julian was the one who was going to take the Reynolds name into the next stratosphere. I was just the one who kept the current stratosphere from collapsing. I remember a specific Sunday dinner 3 years ago. It's a scene that plays on a loop in my head whenever I think about how we got here. We were sitting in the formal dining room, the one with the heavy oak table that my mother used to polish until you could see your own disappointed reflection in it. Julian had just invested another $50,000 of Dad's money into a tech startup that, as far as I could tell, sold high-end air. "It's about the ecosystem, Dad," Julian said, leaning back and swirling a glass of Bordeaux that cost more than my monthly car insurance. "We're disrupting the way people think about connectivity." Dad nodded, his eyes shining with a pride he never directed at me. "He's got the spark, Sarah. You have to have the spark to win in this world." I sat at the far end of the table, my laptop open next to my plate because I was finishing the quarterly tax filings for Dad's actual company. The company that provided the $50,000 Julian was currently setting on fire. "The spark didn't reconcile the warehouse inventory last week, Julian," I said, my voice flat. "I did. We were short 300 pallets because your connectivity app didn't track the outgoing shipments." Julian didn't even look at me. He just sighed, a long, theatrical sound of a great man being bothered by a small insect. "Sarah, you're so focused on the dirt that you never see the mountain. That's why you'll always be a manager and I'll be an owner." Dad chuckled and reached over to pat Julian's hand. "She's a worker bee, son. Every hive needs them, but you're the one who builds the hive." That was the recurring symbolic object of my life, the ledger. Since I was 22, I had carried a black moleskin notebook where I tracked everything. Not just business expenses, but the invisible costs of Julian's existence. I tracked the $12,000, bridge loan, Dad gave him for a condo deposit that Julian spent on a trip to Ibiza. I tracked the $8,000 legal fees when Julian nearly got sued for breach of contract. I tracked the 3 months I spent working 16-hour days when Julian decided he needed a sabbatical to find his muse in Chalum. I was the invisible safety net. When the warehouse roof leaked at 3:00 a.m., the alarm company called me, not Julian. When the main shipping clerk quit because Julian talked down to him, I was the one who spent my Saturday training a replacement. But the hierarchy was set in stone. Julian was the heir apparent, the golden boy who could do no wrong because he promised a future that looked like a magazine cover. I was the scratched label, the reliable but unexciting daughter who was expected to provide the floor so Julian could have the ceiling. One afternoon, about a year before Dad's heart started to fail, I found Julian in Dad's office. He was sitting in the big leather chair, feet up on the desk, holding a vintage fountain pen that had belonged to our grandfather. "You know," Julian said, clicking the pen cap open and shut. "When Dad finally steps back, I'm thinking of rebranding. Reynolds Global. Sounds better, right? We'll sell off the trucks. It's all about digital assets now." "We move physical goods, Julian," I said, picking up a stack of invoices he'd ignored. "If you sell the trucks, there is no company." "Spoken like a true worker bee," he sneered. "Don't worry, Sarah. I'll keep you on. You're great with the little things, the boring things." I didn't say anything. I just adjusted the ledger under my arm. I realized then that Julian didn't just want the inheritance. He wanted to erase the very foundation of what made our family's life possible. He wanted the glory without the grease on his hands. The real shift happened during the annual Founders Gala for the local business association. It was a black tie event, and Dad was being honored for his 40 years of service. I had spent 6 weeks coordinating the logistics, vetting the guest list, and even writing Dad's speech. Julian showed up 40 minutes late, wearing a tuxedo that cost $5,000, money he'd borrowed from the company's emergency maintenance fund, though I didn't know that yet. When Dad got up to speak, he held up his glass. The room went quiet. "I've spent 40 years building this," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion. "And as I look to the future, I know it's in good hands. My son Julian has the vision to take us where I couldn't. He is the heart of the next generation of Reynolds." He didn't mention me, not once. I was the one who had checked the microphones, ensured the catering was hot, and stayed sober to drive him home. But in that room under those crystal chandeliers, I was a ghost. I looked at Julian. He was beaming, soaking in the applause like it was his birthright. He caught my eye and gave me a tiny, mocking wink. It was a look that said, "I can take everything you build, and they'll still thank me for it." I felt a cold, sharp stone settle in my stomach that night. It wasn't just jealousy. It was the realization of a fundamental danger. Julian wasn't just a spoiled brother. He was a predator who viewed my labor as his natural resource. 3 months later, Dad collapsed in the middle of the warehouse floor. And that was when the visionary finally had to face a reality that couldn't be solved with a pitch deck or a charming smile. The first time the financial damage became undeniable was 6 months before Dad's collapse. It wasn't a single explosion. It was a slow, deliberate bleeding of the company's marrow. I was sitting in my small, windowless office at the back of the warehouse, the smell of diesel and old cardboard clinging to the walls. I was trying to figure out why our primary fuel supplier, Miller and Sons, had sent a final notice for a $14,000 balance. We always paid on the first. I handled the checks. I knew the money had been allocated. When I logged into the corporate operating account, my heart did a slow, sickening roll. There was a series of wire transfers, 6 of them, all for $2,400, labeled simply as consulting fees. They were sent to an LLC I didn't recognize, Aurelius Ventures. I didn't have to guess who was behind it. Julian's middle name is Aurelius. I walked into Dad's office with the bank statement. Julian was there, of course, draped over one of the guest chairs, scrolling through his phone. He looked up, his expression shifting from bored to guarded in a fraction of a second. "Dad, we're missing nearly $15,000 from the operating budget," I said, laying the paper on the desk. "It went to an LLC Julian set up. The fuel bill is past due. If Miller cuts us off, the trucks don't move tomorrow morning." Dad looked at the statement, then at Julian. Julian didn't even flinch. He just gave a small, indulgent laugh. "It's an investment, Sarah. Aurelius is a subsidiary I'm building to handle our digital logistics. I'm essentially paying myself to modernize Dad's dinosaur of a filing system. It's all internal." "It's not internal if the fuel supplier isn't getting paid," I snapped. "That money was for overhead. You're draining the blood out of the business for a subsidiary that doesn't even have a tax ID." Dad rubbed his face, his hand shaking slightly, the first sign of the physical toll the stress was taking. "Julian, you should have cleared it with Sarah. She keeps the books." "I shouldn't have to clear how I spend family money with the help, Dad," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming that smooth, manipulative honey he used whenever he wanted to win. "I'm trying to scale us. Sarah wants us to stay a mom-and-pop shop forever because she's scared of anything she can't count on her fingers." "Do you want to be a legend or do you want to be a bookkeeper?" Dad looked at me and I saw the choice being made in his eyes. He didn't want to hear about fuel bills or final notice red ink. He wanted to believe in the legend Julian was selling. "Pay the fuel bill from the reserve fund, Sarah," Dad said quietly. "And Julian, just keep me in the loop next time." "Reserve fund?" I whispered. "Dad, that's for the new axles. That's our safety net." "Do it, Sarah," he barked, the edge returning to his voice. "And stop hounding your brother. He's trying to think big." I went back to my office and opened the ledger. I didn't just record the $14,400. I recorded the date, the time, and the exact words Dad used. I felt like I was watching a slow-motion train wreck, and I was the only one standing on the tracks trying to wave the red flag. The damage escalated 3 weeks later. I was at the grocery store, ringing up a modest basket of supplies, when my personal debit card was declined. I knew I had $3,000 in that account. I'd been saving for a down payment on a small condo of my own, finally trying to get some distance from the family home I still shared with Dad. I checked my app while the cashier waited, her face a mask of polite pity. My balance was $14.22. A series of authorized transfers had moved my savings into the business account. When I confronted Dad, he wouldn't even look at me. "Julian said we were hit with a surprise audit penalty," Dad mumbled, staring at a shipping manifest. "He said you'd want to help the family. It's all going to come back to you tenfold when we go public, Sarah. Think of it as a short-term loan." "You took my personal savings, Dad, without asking." "We're a family," Julian shouted from the doorway. He was wearing a new pair of Italian leather loafers. "Why are you so transactional? Everything is mine, mine, mine with you. If the company goes under, we all lose. Be a team player for once." I realized then that they weren't just exploiting my labor. They were cannibalizing my future to fuel Julian's present. Every dollar I earned, every hour I sacrificed, was seen as a common resource for Julian to harvest. The spark needed a lot of expensive wood to keep burning, and I was the one being chopped into kindling. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I went to the bank the next morning and opened a new account at a different institution, one my father's name wasn't attached to. I started small. I took a weekend job doing freelance bookkeeping for a local construction firm. I told Dad I was visiting a friend. I began to realize that the only way to survive a family that views you as an appliance is to start unplugging yourself, one chord at a time. But I wasn't fast enough. The real event that signaled the end of my patience was the night of the Founders Award dinner. After Dad's speech, the one where he erased me entirely, Julian pulled me aside in the hallway of the hotel. He was flushed with champagne and ego. "Great night, sis," he said, leaning against the floral wallpaper. "Listen, I need you to sign some papers tomorrow. Dad's transferring the title of the warehouse property into a holding company. My holding company." I went still. "The warehouse is Dad's only real asset, Julian. It's the collateral for the business loans." "It was," Julian smirked. "But Dad realizes that in the new economy, physical assets are liabilities. I'm going to leverage the equity to fund a series of acquisitions in the tech space. It's the move, Sarah. The big play. If you leverage that property and the tech space fails, Dad loses his business and his home. He'll have nothing." Julian leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and unearned confidence. "He'll have me, and I'll have the money. You just keep your head down and keep filing the papers. That's what you're good at, right? Being the invisible girl." He patted my cheek, a condescending, stinging gesture, and walked back into the ballroom to receive more praise for a life he hadn't built. I stood in that hallway, the muffled sound of applause leaking through the doors, and I felt the last thread of my loyalty snap. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that Julian was planning to leave our father a hollow shell, and Dad was handing him the hammer to do it. I opened my purse and pulled out the ledger. I turned to a fresh page. I didn't write about the warehouse. I wrote a list of the documents I would need to find. Julian thought I was an invisible worker bee. He forgot that bees have stings, and worker bees are the only ones who know where every single grain of honey is hidden. The next morning, I didn't go into the office. I went to a lawyer's office downtown, a man who had been a friend of my mother's before she died. I showed him the ledger. "This is a mess, Sarah," he said, peering through his spectacles. "What your brother is doing, it's not just unethical. If he's moving funds from your personal account without a power of attorney, it's criminal." "I don't want to put him in jail," I said, my voice trembling. "I just want to stop him from destroying my father." "The problem," the lawyer said, "is that your father is letting him do it. You can't save someone who is holding the hand of their own executioner." He was right. I couldn't save Dad through logic or pleading. I would have to wait for the reality to hit him so hard he couldn't ignore the bruises. 2 weeks later, the reality hit. Dad didn't just get a final notice. He got a knock on the door from a process server. Julian had invested the property taxes into a crypto scheme that had evaporated overnight. Dad collapsed 10 minutes after the server left. As I watched the paramedics load him into the ambulance, Julian was on the sidewalk, frantically talking into his phone. He wasn't talking to a doctor. He was talking to his broker. "I need to liquidate," Julian was saying. "I don't care about the penalty. I need the cash now." He didn't look at the ambulance. He didn't look at me. He was looking at his disappearing vision. That was the night we ended up in that freezing hospital hallway. The night Julian looked at the doctors and told them to let our father die because he was a lost cause, while the keys to his new car rattled in his pocket. The escalation from financial meddling to total identity erasure happened in the 3 months leading up to the hospital. It wasn't just that Julian was taking money anymore. He was actively rewriting the history of who actually kept the Reynolds family afloat. I arrived at the office on a Tuesday morning to find my desk cleared. Not packed, cleared. My pens, my stapler, and most importantly, the physical backup files of the shipping logs were gone. In their place sat a sleek, ultra-thin monitor and a small succulent in a white ceramic pot. "What is this?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Julian strolled out of Dad's office, a tablet tucked under his arm. He looked like he'd stepped out of a tech brochure. "It's called optimization, Sarah. I've moved all the administrative functions to a virtual assistant firm in Estonia. Higher efficiency, lower overhead. We don't need a dedicated office manager anymore. I'm not an office manager, Julian. I'm the VP of operations. I handle the DOT compliance, the insurance renewals, and the payroll. You were the VP of operations, Julian corrected, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. But Dad and I agreed, your style is stagnant, you're a legacy cost, we're pivoting to a lean model. You can still help out with Dad's personal errands, of course. He still needs someone to pick up his heart medication and manage his dry cleaning. I pushed past him into Dad's office. Dad was sitting there, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The overhead lights caught the gray in his skin. Dad, did you authorize this? Julian fired me from my own company. Dad wouldn't meet my eyes. He was fidgeting with a stress ball, one with Julian's new Aurelius Ventures logo on it. It's not firing, Sarah. It's a reorganization. Julian says the numbers don't lie. He says your department is where the profit leaks are happening. The profit leaks are Julian's wire transfers, I shouted. I have the receipts, Dad. I have the ledger. That's enough. Dad finally looked up, and for a second the old, hard-edged Arthur Reynolds was back, but directed at the wrong target. Julian is trying to save this company from the debt you keep whining about. He showed me the projections. By next year, we'll be a $10 million firm. If you can't support that vision, then you're just dead weight. Dead weight. The words felt like a physical blow. I had spent my entire 20s ensuring he never missed a mortgage payment, and I was being called dead weight by the man who was currently drowning in his son's delusions. The widening cost began to bleed into my life outside the warehouse. Because Julian had optimized my role, he also optimized my salary. He deconvinced Dad that since I was family, my compensation should be tied to the success of Aurelius Ventures, a company that had zero revenue. My mortgage was due on the 15th. On the 14th, I received a notification that my paycheck, the one I'd been counting on to cover my bills since my savings had been borrowed, was $1,200 short. I called the payroll service. There was a manual adjustment, the clerk told me, authorized by Julian Reynolds. He listed it as a repayment for unauthorized personal expenses. I hadn't made any personal expenses on the company card, but I knew what Julian was doing. He was creating a paper trail of theft to discredit me in case I ever went to Dad with the full truth. He wasn't just stealing my present, he was poisoning my reputation to secure his future. I walked into the local diner that evening, needing a coffee and a place to think. I saw two of our long-haul drivers, Big Mike and Sal, sitting in a booth. These were men I'd known for a decade. I'd helped Mike's daughter get a scholarship. I'd sat with Sal when his wife was in the ICU. When I approached them, the air in the booth turned cold. "Hey guys," I said softly. Mike looked at his plate. Sal cleared his throat. "Sarah, we heard about the audit. Julian said you were the one who'd been skimming the fuel surcharges, said that's why our bonuses were cut this year." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Mike, you know me, I've never taken a cent. Julian is the one who, Julian showed us the spreadsheets, Sarah," Sal interrupted, his voice thick with disappointment. Hard to argue with the red ink. We thought you were on our side. They got up and left before I could say another word. Julian wasn't just erasing my role, he was erasing my character. He was turning my only allies, the people who actually did the work, against me. That night, I went home and sat in the dark of my living room. I realized that the worker bee strategy was over. I couldn't outwork a liar who owned the ears of the judge and the jury. I pulled out the ledger. I realized I needed more than just notes. I needed a second folder. A folder Julian didn't know existed because he never bothered to look at the boring stuff. I had been blind copied on every single automated consulting fee invoice sent to Aurelius Ventures. I had saved every text message where Julian asked me to cover for him while he was out of town. And I had something else, the login credentials for the warehouse security system, which I'd installed myself 3 years ago. I logged in from my laptop. I started scrolling through the footage from the previous Sunday, a day the office was supposed to be closed. There was Julian. He wasn't optimizing. He was in Dad's office, opening the floor safe. He was taking out the original property deed and the corporate seal. He was filming the documents with his phone, likely to send them to a predatory lender for a bridge loan Dad knew nothing about. But the most chilling part was the audio. The new cameras had high-gain mics. Julian was on the phone. "Yeah, the old man is fading," I heard him say, his voice echoing in the empty office. "He'll sign whatever I put in front of him as long as I tell him it's for the legacy. Once the title is moved, I'm liquidating the fleet. Sarah, she's a non-issue. I've already made her look like a thief. If she talks, nobody believes a disgraced bookkeeper." He laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that broke something inside me for good. I didn't cry. I didn't even get angry. I felt a strange, cold clarity. Julian thought he was playing a game of vision. I was playing a game of evidence. He was counting on my silence and my loyalty to a father who had already abandoned me. He didn't realize that when you strip a person of everything, their job, their savings, their reputation, and their family, you also strip them of their fear. I spent the rest of the night printing. By 4:00 a.m., I had a 60-page dossier. Every wire transfer, every faked invoice, the transcript of the video, and the bank records showing my stolen money moving into Julian's personal accounts. I was ready to show Dad. I was going to go in that morning and end it. But when I pulled into the warehouse at 8:00 a.m., the ambulance was already there. Dad had found the bridge loan paperwork Julian had left on the desk. His heart, the heart that had spent 40 years building a life Julian was currently selling for parts, finally gave out. In the hospital, while the doctors fought to stabilize him, Julian stood by the vending machine, complaining that the hospital's Wi-Fi was too slow to check his stock portfolio. "He might not make it, Julian," I said, my voice a ghost of itself. "Then I guess the legacy passes to me a little sooner than expected," he replied, not even looking up from his screen. "Make sure you have the keys to the house, Sarah. I'll need to get the appraiser in there by Friday." He had already buried our father in his mind, but he didn't know I was standing there with the shovel that was going to dig his own grave. The spillover from the family business into my actual survival happened the week Dad was moved from the ICU to a step-down unit. I was sitting by his bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, when my phone buzzed with an email notification from my mortgage lender. Urgent, notice of default. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring. I had set up an automatic payment from the new account I'd opened, but when I checked the balance, it was zero. Worse than zero, it was overdrawn by $4,000. I called the bank from the hospital cafeteria, my voice shaking. "How is this possible? This is a private account." "My father and brother aren't on the signature card. There was a court-ordered garnishment, Ms. Reynolds," the representative said, her voice professionally cold. "A claim was filed by Aurelius Ventures for recovery of embezzled corporate funds. Since your name was flagged in their internal audit, the temporary injunction allowed them to freeze and sweep any accounts associated with your social security number." Julian hadn't just fired me. He had used the fake audit he'd manufactured to legally rob me. He was using the legal system as a weapon to ensure I didn't have the financial resources to fight him or pay for Dad's care. I walked back to Dad's room, my chest feeling like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press. Julian was there, standing over Dad's bed, holding a clipboard. He looked up and smiled, a sharp, victorious baring of teeth. "Rough day, Sarah?" he asked. I heard there might be some complications with your personal finances. It's a shame. If you'd just been a team player, we wouldn't have had to involve the lawyers. You lied to a judge, Julian, I whispered. You told them I stole money to get my accounts frozen. I showed them the ledger, he said, stepping closer. Not your little black book, but the real one, the one I've been maintaining. It shows years of you skimming off the top. Who do you think they're going to believe? The visionary CEO taking the company into the future, or the bitter daughter who was just demoted for incompetence? He leaned down and adjusted Dad's blanket with a mock tenderness that made my skin crawl. By the way, I've decided to move Dad to a state-run facility once he's discharged. The private rehab center is just too expensive, and since the company assets are currently tied up in my new acquisitions, we need to tighten our belts. He built that company, I hissed. He deserves the best care. He deserves what he can afford, Julian shrugged. And since you've mismanaged so much of the family wealth, this is where we are. The dread was no longer just about the business. It was about the fact that Julian was willing to let our father rot in a substandard facility just to keep his investment capital liquid. He was erasing Dad's dignity as easily as he'd erased my career. The final spillover happened that evening. I returned to my small house to find a for sale sign being hammered into the front lawn. "What are you doing?" I screamed at the man in the neon vest. "Listings live, ma'am," he said, not looking up. "Contract signed by the owner of the holding company, Reynolds Global LLC. Julian hadn't just taken my money. He had used the bridge loan he'd tricked Dad into signing to put my house up as collateral. Because I had moved in when the company was doing well, Dad had helped with the down payment through the corporate entity. Julian had found the loophole. He was evicting me. I stood on the sidewalk, my life packed into the back of my old SUV, and realized the scale of the trap. I had no job, no savings, no home, and a reputation that had been dragged through the mud of the local business community. Julian had spent months building a cage, and I had been too busy working to notice the bars being welded shut around me. I looked down at the ledger in my hand. It was the only thing he hadn't managed to take. I realized then that I couldn't fight him in the arena he owned. I couldn't win in a world of projections and visions. I had to bring him into my world. The world of cold, hard, undeniable facts. I didn't go to a hotel. I drove to the one place Julian would never think to look for me, the dusty, grease-stained apartment above the warehouse, where our retired head mechanic, Elias, still lived. Elias had been with Dad since the first truck. He knew where the literal and metaphorical bodies were buried. And more importantly, he was the only person Julian had forgotten to manipulate because he didn't think the help mattered. "Sarah," Elias said, opening the door, the smell of tobacco and motor oil wafting out. "What are you doing here this late?" "Julian is killing the company, Elias," I said, my voice finally breaking. "And he's killing Dad. I need your help to prove it." Elias looked at my car, piled high with my belongings, then back at me. He stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in, kid. I've been waiting for someone to finally ask." Elias' apartment was a graveyard of old machinery and yellowed photographs, but to me, it felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in months. He didn't pity me. He didn't offer platitudes about family. He simply cleared a stack of engine manuals off a chair and handed me a mug of coffee that tasted like battery acid and salvation. "Your brother," Elias said, his voice a low rasp, "is a man who thinks the world is made of glass because he's never had to swing a hammer. He thinks if he hides the cracks, the structure is still sound. But I've been watching the shipments, Sarah. I've been watching the manifest." Elias wasn't just a mechanic. He was the logistical heartbeat of the warehouse. While Julian was busy optimizing the front office into a digital ghost town, Elias had been keeping his own set of books, the physical log. Every time a truck left the yard, Elias noted the weight, the destination, and the driver. Julian told the virtual assistants that we were running half capacity to save on fuel, Elias said, sliding a greasy clipboard across the table. But the trucks are leaving full, Sarah. And they aren't going to our regular clients. They're going to a private pier in New Jersey. Cash on delivery. None of it is hitting the company books. I looked at the dates. The off-book shipments had started the same week my personal accounts were frozen. Julian wasn't just stealing the company's future. He was actively liquidating its current inventory and pocketing the cash to fund his Aurelius lifestyle, all while making it look like the business was failing under my mismanagement. "Why didn't you tell Dad?" I asked. "I tried," Elias sighed, rubbing his oil-stained knuckles. "But your father, he's got a fever for that boy. He told me I was old guard and that I didn't understand how modern business worked. He said if Julian says we're lean, we're lean." He stopped trusting his eyes and started trusting that boy's PowerPoint slides. That was the support I needed. Not a lawyer with a briefcase, but a witness with a wrench. Elias knew the drivers Julian was using, men who weren't Mike or Sal, but contractors Julian had hired from a shady temp agency to ensure no one would ask questions. "I have the video of him in the safe," I told Elias. "And I have the wire transfers, but he's blocked my access to the bank. I can't prove the Aurelius money is his without a subpoena, and I can't afford a lawyer to get one." Elias leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. "You don't need a subpoena for a man who's too arrogant to change his passwords." Julian used the warehouse Wi-Fi to set up his Aurelius portal. He didn't realize the router logs every IP address and every login. And since I'm the one who manages the facility maintenance, I'm the one with the admin key to the router. For the next 4 hours, we sat in the glow of my laptop. With Elias' technical access and my knowledge of the company's financial structure, we began to map the heist. It was breathtaking in its audacity. Julian had created a circular debt loop. He was loaning the company its own stolen cash at 15% interest, effectively turning our father into a debtor to his own son. But the most important discovery came at 3:00 a.m. Julian had scheduled a final asset review for the following Tuesday. He'd invited the board of the local business association and a group of private equity partners, actually just a bunch of his wealthy friends he was trying to impress. He was planning to publicly announce the rebranding of Reynolds Logistics to Aurelius Global. And the centerpiece of that presentation, the voluntary retirement of our father and the termination for cause of the former VP of Operations, me. He was going to use a public arena to cement the lie of my theft and his rescue of the company. "He's going to stand on that stage and bury us," I whispered. "No," Elias said, shutting the laptop with a definitive click. "He's going to stand on that stage and build a gallows. He just doesn't know who the rope is for yet." Elias wasn't just a witness. He was my bridge back to the people Julian had poisoned. Over the next 2 days, Elias made calls. He met Mike and Sal at the diner. He didn't argue with them. He just showed them the physical log and the photos of the temp drivers loading the off-book shipments. One by one, the men who had looked at me with pity and disgust started to look toward the warehouse with a different kind of hunger. The hunger for the truth. By Sunday night, I was no longer an invisible girl in a freezing hospital hallway. I was the architect of a counterstrike. I had the ledger, I had the video, I had the router logs, and I had the loyalty of the men who actually moved the world. Julian had the vision. I had the receipts. And for the first time in my life, I realized that being a worker bee meant I knew exactly how to dismantle the hive from the inside out. By Monday morning, The leverage wasn't just a collection of notes in a ledger, it was an operational strike. Elias and I spent the dawn hours in his kitchen, cross-referencing the warehouse router logs with the Aurelius Ventures shell company filings I'd found. The connection was undeniable. Julian had been using the office high-speed line, the one I'd paid the bill for, to facilitate the off-book sales of our father's inventory. "Look at this, Sarah," Elias said, tapping the screen. Every time an Aurelius wire transfer hits, there's a corresponding login from Julian's laptop at the warehouse coordinates. He was so cheap he wouldn't even buy a VPN. He thought he was untouchable because he was the only one who understood tech. I felt a cold shiver of realization. The leverage wasn't just that he was stealing, it was that he was doing it with the very tools I had provided to keep the business running. My efficiency had become his camouflage. "But we need the why," I said. "Why now? Why the rush to liquidate?" The answer came from a pile of mail Elias had intercepted from the warehouse front desk. Julian had been throwing junk mail into a bin behind the forklift charging station. In that bin, I found a series of letters from a luxury car dealership and a high-end real estate firm in Miami. Julian hadn't just bought a Mercedes. He had put down a non-refundable $150,000 deposit on a penthouse. The final payment was due this Wednesday, the day after his final asset review. He wasn't rebranding the company to grow it. He was rebranding it to gut it, take the cash, and vanish to Florida before the creditors realized the trucks were gone and the warehouse was an empty shell. "He's not planning to run Aurelius Global at all," I whispered. "He's selling the name and the client list to a competitor for a lump sum, and he's leaving Dad with the debt and a state-run nursing home." I looked at the video footage from the floor safe again. I watched Julian's face, the smirk, the way he tossed our grandfather's fountain pen back onto the desk like it was garbage. I didn't just have the truth. I had the timeline. I called the one person who could turn this from a family squabble into a legal wall, Detective Miller. He was a regular at the diner where Mike and Sal ate, a man who had known my father for 20 years. "Sarah," Miller said when I reached him, "I heard you were having some trouble at the firm. Julian told everyone I was embezzling, didn't he?" "He filed a report," Miller admitted, "but he hasn't signed the affidavit yet. Says he wants to give you a chance to return the funds because you're family. He hasn't signed it because he knows a real investigation would look at his accounts too," I said. "I'm at Elias S. I have the router logs, the physical log, and a video of my brother opening the corporate safe at 2:00 a.m. on a Sunday. I also have the records of where the money actually went." There was a long silence on the other end. "The asset review is tomorrow at the warehouse, isn't it?" Miller asked. 2:00 p.m., I said. "He's invited the Chamber of Commerce. He wants a crowd." "Then give him one," Miller replied. "I'll be there, not in uniform. I want to see this vision for myself." I hung up and looked at Elias. The leverage was activated. It wasn't a secret anymore, it was a loaded spring. I had the proof of the theft, the proof of the intent to defraud, and now I had a witness with a badge. But the most important piece of leverage wasn't digital. It was sitting in a hospital bed 5 miles away. I went to see Dad that evening. He was awake, his eyes cloudy but focused. "Sarah," he rasped as I sat by his side. "Julian said." "He said you weren't coming, said you moved away." "I didn't move, Dad. Julian put a for sale sign on my lawn and froze my bank accounts." Dad turned his head away. "He says it's for the legacy. He says you're trying to sink us because you're jealous." I leaned in close. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I just pulled out my tablet and hit play on the video of Julian in the safe. I showed him the physical log. I showed him the consulting fees that paid for a penthouse in Miami. "He isn't building your legacy, Dad," I said quietly. He's selling your life's work for a view of the ocean, and he's doing it while telling the doctors you're a lost cause so he doesn't have to pay the surgical bill. I saw a single tear track through the deep lines on my father's face. The spark he had loved so much had finally burned him, and the pain was finally sharper than the pride. "What do I do?" he whispered. "Tomorrow at 2:00 p.m., I said, handing him a single sheet of paper. "I need you to sign this. It's a temporary revocation of Julian's power of attorney, effective immediately. And then I need you to let me wheel you into that warehouse." Dad looked at the paper. He looked at the daughter he'd called dead weight. "He's my son, Sarah. And I'm the one who paid for your heart to keep beating," I said. "Choose who you want to be at the end of this story, Dad. The man who was fooled or the man who fixed it." He took the pen from the bedside table. His hand shook, but his signature was the same hard, jagged scrawl that had built the company 40 years ago. The leverage was complete. I had the evidence, the authority, and the victim. Now all I needed was the stage. The 48 hours leading up to the asset review were the most disciplined of my life. To Julian, I was a ghost he had successfully exorcised. I had no home, no phone that hadn't been flagged, and no money. In his mind, I was probably sleeping in my car in a different zip code. He didn't know I was 300 yards away, sitting in Elia's darkened apartment, watching the warehouse floor through a hidden feed on my laptop. I watched Julian orchestrate the stage. He had a professional events team bringing in white-clothed bistro tables and a podium with the new Aurelius Global logo. He was fastidious about the lighting, making sure the spotlight would hit him perfectly. He was a man directing his own coronation, oblivious to the fact that the floorboards were rotten. On Monday night, I made my logistical move. Elias and I used his master key to enter the warehouse at 3:00 a.m. We didn't touch Julian's stage. Instead, we went to the server room. We hardwired a secondary line from my laptop directly into the main projector system. I also installed a small, high-definition Bluetooth speaker behind the industrial racking, hidden behind a stack of Aurelius rebranded shipping crates. "If he tries to cut the video, the audio will still carry," Elias whispered, his hands steady as he crimped the wires. "He won't be able to stop the sound without killing the power to the whole building." Tuesday morning was my emotional move. I went to the hospital. Dad was sitting up, dressed in the suit I'd brought him, the one he wore to Mom's funeral. He looked frail, but his eyes were clear. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" he asked. "There's no coming back from this. Not for him, not for us." "Julian already burned the bridge, Dad," I said, kneeling by his wheelchair. "I'm just showing everyone the ashes." I checked my watch. 1:15 p.m. The risk move was next. I called Detective Miller. "We're leaving the hospital now. Are the men ready?" "Mike and Sal are at the gate," Miller confirmed. "They've blocked the secondary exit with 2 of the rigs. If Julian tries to bolt when he sees the police cruiser, he's going to hit 40 tons of steel." I rolled Dad out to my SUV. As we pulled into the warehouse lot at 1:50 p.m., I saw the sleek black cars of the Chamber of Commerce and the local investors. Julian was standing at the entrance, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He was shaking hands, laughing, the picture of the triumphant heir. He didn't see me pull into the loading dock behind the building. He didn't see Elias help me wheel Dad through the service elevator. We positioned ourselves in the dark observation room, the glass-walled office that overlooked the warehouse floor. It was where Dad used to sit to watch the trucks roll out. I turned off the lights and drew the blinds just enough to see out. Down below, the room was full. About 60 people were seated. Julian stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for being here," Julian's voice boomed through the speakers. "Today isn't just about a name change. It's about a transition from the physical to the digital, from the past to the future. My father, Arthur, built a great foundation, but every foundation needs a skyscraper. He clicked a remote and a slide appeared on the giant screen. REYNOLDS Logistics, the final chapter. Unfortunately, Julian continued, his voice dropping into a practiced, somber tone, this transition hasn't been without its tragedies. My sister, Sarah, who many of you know, struggled with the scale of this vision. Her recent financial irregularities have been a blow to the family, but Aurelius Global is about resilience. I felt Dad's hand tighten on the arm of his wheelchair. His knuckles were white. I have a video to show you, Julian said, smiling at the crowd. A vision of what the new Miami headquarters will look like, the future of the Reynolds legacy. He pressed the button for the video. In the observation room, I placed my finger over the enter key on my laptop. Ready, Dad, I whispered. Begin, he said. I hit the key. The video on the giant screen didn't show a Miami penthouse. It didn't show the Aurelius Global logo. Instead, the room was suddenly filled with the grainy, high-contrast footage from the warehouse floor safe. The audio, piped through the hidden Bluetooth speakers Elias had installed, was deafeningly clear. Yeah, the old man is fading, Julian's voice rang out, echoing off the corrugated metal walls. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him as long as I tell him it's for the legacy. Once the title is moved, I'm liquidating the fleet. The room went so still you could hear the hum of the cooling fans in the projector. Julian froze at the podium, his hand still hovering over the remote. His face didn't just turn pale, it turned a bruised, mottled gray. What is this? Someone from the Chamber of Commerce whispered. Is this part of the presentation? I hit the next key. The screen split. On the left, the video continued, Julian laughing as he stuffed the corporate seal into his pocket. On the right, a scrolling ledger of the consulting fees appeared, side by side with the receipts for Julian's new Mercedes and the wire transfers to the Miami real estate firm. Julian, a voice called out from the third row. It was Miller and Sons, fuel representative. That's my company's final notice balance. Why is it being transferred to an LLC called Aurelius? Julian finally found his voice, though it was thin and cracking. This is a hack. My sister, she's unstable. She's trying to sabotage. I'm right here, Julian. I pushed the door to the observation room open. The light from the hallway spilled onto the warehouse floor. I stepped out onto the metal catwalk and then slowly I wheeled Dad into the light. The gasp that went through the room was collective. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the concrete. Dad looked down at the son he had championed for 30 years, and for the first time he didn't look at him with pride. He looked at him with the cold, clinical detachedness of a man inspecting a rotten piece of freight. The hack is over, son, Dad said, his voice amplified by the microphone I'd clipped to his lapel. Julian scrambled. He actually tried to run toward the loading dock, but Big Mike and Sal were already there, their massive frames blocking the exit. Detective Miller stepped out from the back of the room, showing his badge. Julian Reynolds, Miller said, we have some questions about a fraudulent audit report and a few dozen unauthorized wire transfers. You can't do this, Julian screamed, his composure finally shattering. He pointed a shaking finger at me. She's a worker bee, she's nothing. I'm the one with the vision. Without me, this company is just a pile of trucks and grease. Without you, I said, my voice steady and echoing from the catwalk, this company has a future. Without you, the bills get paid. And without you, Dad gets the care he actually earned. I hit the final key on my laptop. The screen showed one last document, the $78,400 hospital bill, stamped paid in full with my name as the sole guarantor, followed by the bank statement showing Julian's Aurelius account balance, which was exactly the amount he'd stolen from the company's tax reserves. The room shifted. The investors Julian had been courting began to back away from him as if he were contagious. The local business leaders, men who had known our father for decades, looked at the floor in shame. Julian looked around the room, searching for one face that would offer him a way out. He found nothing but the cold, hard reality of the people he had tried to erase. He didn't go out with a visionary speech. He went out in handcuffs, sobbing about how unfair it was that the boring girl had finally learned how to count. As the police let him out, I looked at Dad. He reached out and took my hand. His grip was weak, but he didn't let go. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered. I didn't see the mountain. I was too busy looking at the spark. "The mountain was always here, Dad," I said. "I just had to stop holding it up long enough for you to see it." The aftermath wasn't a series of explosions. It was a long, cold silence. Julian's Aurelius Global dissolved before the first rebranded truck could even be painted. Without the warehouse as collateral, his private equity partners vanished, and his Miami penthouse deposit was forfeited to cover a fraction of the legal fees. He's currently serving a 3-year sentence for corporate fraud and embezzlement. I haven't visited him. I haven't taken his calls. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt. They need to be left at the bottom of the river so you can finally learn how to swim. Dad spent 4 months in a private cardiac rehab center, one I paid for with the funds I recovered after the court unfroze my accounts. It took time, but the worker bee finally took her place at the head of the table. I didn't just save the company, I modernized it. We don't have visionary subsidiaries anymore. We have a profit-sharing plan for the drivers, a digital tracking system that actually works, and a ledger that finally balances. I'm sitting on the loading dock now, watching the sun dip behind the tree line. The air smells like rain and diesel, the smell of a life that is finally, undeniably mine. My father is sitting in his old office behind me. He doesn't make the big decisions anymore, but he likes to watch the trucks roll out. Sometimes, he looks at me and starts to say something, an apology, a thank you, a recognition of the years he spent looking past me. I usually just squeeze his hand and hand him a cup of coffee. The truth doesn't always need a speech. Sometimes it just needs to be lived. I am Sarah Reynolds. I am 31 years old. I am a daughter, a CEO, and the woman who stopped waiting for a seat at the table and built a whole new warehouse instead. That's my story. It's not about revenge. It's about the moment you realize that your value isn't determined by who notices you, but by what you're willing to protect. If you've ever been the invisible one in your family, the one who does the work while someone else takes the credit, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between your loyalty and your survival? What was the ledger moment that changed everything for you? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. If this story meant something to you, check out the video on the screen now for another story about finding your voice in a family that tried to silence it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to join our community. Your story matters, even if you're still the only one writing it down.